Okay, so we're going to start off with part 2 of the American Revolution now. And the British will abandon Boston because they see it as untenable. They are surrounded, and so they're going to abandon Boston and head to New York. The Continental Congress will order George Washington to take his army to defend New York. Now, Washington thinks this is a bad idea, simply because much of New York is an island and the Americans don't have a navy. But Washington does think that there should be some attempt to defend New York. Well, it ends up being a disaster, and you can read about the battles of New York, it's pretty complicated, but Washington is forced to leave New York. He's constantly beaten. His militiamen aren't as experienced. Washington is still finding his way as a general. And with these constant defeats in New York, there is some talk about replacing Washington, even within the army. Well, Washington knows that he needs a victory, and it's getting to be winter in 1776. And usually armies in the winter times would go into winter quarters because it was hard to fight in the winter. It was hard to provide food. It was cold. Your powder would be wet, so you couldn't fire your guns. But Washington decided that he'll do one last battle. And this is a famous scene. You've probably seen Washington crossing the Delaware, where he takes about 2,400 men and he attacks Trenton, New Jersey, and defeats about 1,500 Hessians, German mercenaries. And then goes on to win at the Battle of Princeton. There was only one man wounded, one Lieutenant James Monroe, and the future president. And then Washington will go into winter quarters. For the British, they didn't think too much of these minor victories by the Patriots, but for Washington's men, it calms the talk of replacing him, and it helps with recruitment. Well, when we look at the American society for revolution, often we see just everybody's, they'll show on TV, everybody's for the revolution. It really wasn't. In most cases, you had about a third of the Americans wanting independence. You had a third wanting to stay loyal to England. And then you had a third that were fairly neutral, weren't sure which side to take. But because of these divided loyalties, especially when we get to South Carolina, there is going to be some very nasty fighting as sides seek revenge against other sides for old grievances. The Continental Army wasn't much of an army. It was citizen soldiers. They often would fire and then retreat. They tended to unnecessarily torture prisoners and kill prisoners. They preferred to ambush rather than face them in hand-to-hand combat or be in traditional formations, because this is how they had learned to fight on the frontier. Washington would like to have a professional British army, or British-style army, let's put it that way. He would like to have a professional army so he could go charge headlong into the British and crush them. But Washington doesn't have that yet. And so Washington becomes very good at retreating, because Washington understands that really the only symbol of the country as a whole is the army. And as long as the army was still around, people could rally about that. So he'll retreat a lot. In fact, when you look at Washington's record as a general, he only wins 3 of the 10 battles that he fights. So he understands he's in for the long haul, and that winning battles isn't necessarily the way to win the war. Well, the British decide on a strategy to, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. And if we can do that, we think that they're the troublemakers, and that'll cause us a lot less headaches. And the idea is that they will go down Lake Champlain from Canada, led by gentleman Johnny Burgoyne, with about 5,000 troops, and then go down to the Hudson River, and then meet at Albany with another group of British armies, led by General Howe, going up from New York to Albany to bisect the New England colonies. Well, this has got some problems, and I think I said the last time that the old saying is that amateurs study tactics, professional soldiers study logistics. Burgoyne doesn't understand where he's going. He's got a wagon train of over a mile long, including about 5 carts of his own personal belongings. He's got his mistress with him. He's got champagne. He's a professional playwright, probably a better playwright than general. And he doesn't understand the backcountry of New York. It is a rainforest, and they have to keep building bridges. And the longer that they are delayed trying to make it through this dense forest, the more their supplies are used up, more of their men suffer from illness and are not able to fight. And eventually even their Indian allies start fading away, saying this is going to be a disaster. And Burgoyne is also stymied by a lack of communication with General Howe. General Howe decides that, well, I'm not going to go that way. I'm going to go down and capture Philadelphia, and that'll end the war, because in Europe, if you captured the enemy's capital, they would surrender. Well, I guess Philadelphia is the capital, but it really wasn't. When he goes to Philadelphia, what happens is the Continental Congress just goes and moves and meets somewhere else. So Burgoyne is by himself, and he is going to run into the Americans more than he thought, because the Americans swarmed down upon him at the Battle of Saratoga, where he will be defeated at the Battle of Saratoga by the Americans and have to surrender his 5,000 men. It's a huge defeat. And the hero of the Battle of Saratoga is, of course, Benedict Arnold. He's shot from under his horse. He's injured. He still rallies his men. It's an amazing feat. And Arnold is the American hero of the hour. It's one of the things that's going to eventually turn Arnold against the Patriot cause, because he feels like he doesn't get his recognition for doing so. The impact of the Battle of Saratoga and the surrender on October 17, 1777, is that it gets an alliance with France. France had been looking for ways to seek revenge against the Americans against the British, for the loss in the 7 Years' War. They are early on looking at this early revolution between the Americans and the British. They're providing some covert aid, but they're not sure the Americans can win. And so they're not ready to go all out for the Americans until they saw some sort of victory. And Saratoga was that victory. It convinced the French that the Americans could win this war, and it does create an alliance. So France becomes the first country in the world to recognize America's independence. Well, for Britain now, it's a whole new ballgame, right? Because France is just right across the channel. It's a real enemy. It's their hated enemy. They know that France could actually invade them. This is no longer some colonial affair far, far away. And so now they've got to fight the French, and then Spain enters the war on the side of France, not of the United States, but France. And then in 1780, Britain declared war on the Dutch. So it essentially has become a world war. Well, sum this up. Like I said, it's a survey course. There's some great series on the American Revolution, one called Liberty, the American Revolution. It's about 20-something years old, but a lot of good YouTube videos as well if you want to watch some more in detail. The British had failed trying to separate New England. That had failed. They had failed by trying to conquer the middle colonies like New York and Philadelphia. So they thought, we're going to head down south. And they believed that down in the Carolinas, that there was a stronger loyalist sentiment, a Tory sentiment, you might say, because they've been told that. And generals tended to believe, well, political leaders in general sort of believe the information that's positive given to them and ignore the ones that are negative. That's sometimes known as confirmation bias. But the British will be surrounded at a place called Yorktown and forced to surrender again. It was a combined force of the French and then the American army led by George Washington, and now his probably Washington's most trusted aide, uh, the Marquis de Lafayette, a Frenchman, a young Frenchman, about 19, who became one of Washington's chief aides and trusted advisors. In fact, Washington never had children of his own, and so he sees Lafayette as sort of an adopted son. But they surround Yorktown and they begin a siege, and eventually Yorktown will be forced to surrender on October 17th, 1781, 4 days after Saratoga. 7,000 British soldiers have to surrender to the Americans and the French. The British Prime Minister, when heard of the news, he said, "Oh God, it's all over." But keep in mind, the Americans don't know this. Nobody knows this is in 1781. The actual peace will not be signed until 1783. So this is one of these examples of looking at history backwards. We think, oh, well, Yorktown, they win, therefore it's all good. But they didn't know that at the time. But peace will come in with the Peace of Paris in 1783. The Americans get what they want, independence. They also get all the land to the Mississippi. So they've gone from these little colonies all the way to the Mississippi. They've more than doubled the size of their country. They also got fishing rights off Newfoundland and the St. Lawrence Gulf because cod was so important to the New England colonies. Now, it's interesting to note that when the Americans had made an alliance with France, they both agreed that there would be no separate peace, that they wouldn't go behind the other one's back and make peace. Well, that's exactly what the Americans do. They go out and make peace and get their own independence. Well, let's turn back a little bit in time and go to 1781, 2 years before the peace. You're independent, you're going to have a new government. And so they're going to create a new government of the colonies called the Articles of Confederation. It's going to go from 1781, 1789. It's going to create a unicameral or one-house legislature. There's not going to be an independent judicial branch. There's not going to be an independent executive branch. Most of the power is going to be within the hands of the states. So under this Articles of Confederation, each state got one vote, no matter how big you were. If you wanted to pass laws, you had to have 9 of 13 states to agree, a supermajority. To amend the articles would require unanimous consent. All of them would have to agree. The government had no power to levy taxes, no power to raise an army, no power to control interstate trade, or even regulate the currency. States were using different currencies. So this made it very difficult for a national government to organize or to have any influence whatsoever. But this is the way early on the colonies wanted it, because if you were to ask people after the American Revolution, what country you're from, they would not say the United States. They would say, my country is Connecticut, my country is Virginia. And so it's not this idea that there's a United States just yet, right? And they see themselves as independent nations. The French are going to send 13 different ambassadors. So we don't know who to talk to, right? Now, the Confederation does have some success. It creates a land policy because now you adopted all this new land out toward the Mississippi. What was going to happen to those new lands? Are they going to become colonies? Are they going to have a chance to become states? If they're going to become states, how would they become states? What would be the process? And so under the Articles of Confederation, they passed a series of land ordinances, 1784, 1785, 1787. And what they would do is, one of the things, it set up how you survey, right? Everything would be surveyed in square miles. That's 640 acres. People could be allowed and buy this land. And the land ordinance of 1787, sometimes called the Northwest Ordinance, said that slavery would not be allowed in any of these new areas. Okay, so now here we are in 1787, and we're having this issue of slavery. And it also determined how you would become a state, this Northwest Ordinance of 1787. They said, look, you know, once you got to a certain part of a population, you could become a sort of a territory, and that would territory be ruled by a governor, a secretary, and 3 judges, all chosen by Congress. And then when any one of these territories had 5,000 free adult males, it could choose an assembly. And then when they got to 60,000, they could adopt a state constitution and apply for statehood. And this is going to be important later on when we get to the 1850s and the 1840s. But it is setting up the precedent that these new areas would be admitted as equals in the American Republic. All right, so next time, what we're going to talk about is the problems of the Confederation and the leading up to the Constitutional Convention.